It ended before anyone raised their voice. Backstage, away from cameras, Steve McQueen watched as his 350-pound bodyguard reached for Bruce Lee with confidence shaped by size and reputation. What followed was brief, almost unnoticeable to those who didn't understand what they were seeing. There was no struggle, no spectacle, and no explanation offered afterward. Yet when it was over, the room had changed, and the lesson stayed with everyone who witnessed it. It existed parallel to the sets and lights the public recognized, governed by its own customs and quiet hierarchies. Here, there were no applause cues, no marks taped to the floor, no scripts to soften uncertainty. What mattered backstage was not performance, but proximity. Who stood where, who spoke when, and who did not need to speak at all. On film sets, in that era, authority was rarely announced. It accumulated silently. Actors carried it through reputation. Crew members carried it through experience. Security carried it through physical presence. Everyone understood these roles instinctively, and most conflicts dissolved before they ever formed. But occasionally, something slipped through the structure. Bruce Lee moved through backstage spaces differently than most. He did not arrive with entourage or demand attention. He walked lightly, alert without appearing cautious, as though every hallway and corner were already familiar to him. He spoke politely, briefly, and only when necessary. Those who encountered him for the first time often underestimated him, not out of malice, but because he did not display the signals people associated with control. Control in those spaces was usually visible. Steve McQueen understood this environment well. He had earned his place not by volume, but by consistency. His presence was calm, self-contained. He did not involve himself in unnecessary disputes. When he brought security with him, it was not for show. It was a practical decision, one that came with clear expectations. The bodyguard embodied those expectations fully. He was large enough that people adjusted their movement unconsciously when he entered a room. His posture did not invite conversation. His silence carried weight. In most situations, that was enough. Physical authority, when unquestioned, rarely needs to prove itself. Backstage that day, the atmosphere was unremarkable. Equipment was being moved. Conversations overlapped quietly. People passed one another with professional indifference. Nothing suggested confrontation. Yet environments like this magnify subtle shifts. A pause in conversation. A glance held a second, longer than usual. A sense that someone had stepped outside their assigned role. Bruce Lee did not announce his presence. He did not challenge the existing order. He simply occupied space with an ease that did not conform to expectations. To some, this registered as confidence. To others, as an invitation. The bodyguard noticed him, not immediately, and not with hostility. At first, it was curiosity, how someone so compact moved without hesitation through a space governed by size, how he did not alter his path or posture in response to mass. These observations accumulated quietly, without conclusion. In environments where authority is assumed, unexplained calm can feel disruptive, Steve McQueen observed from a distance. He did not intervene. There was no reason to. Nothing had yet crossed into conflict, but he was attentive enough to sense when equilibrium begins to thin. Backstage, challenges rarely announce themselves. They arrive as questions, unspoken, unresolved, and, once a question of authority forms in silence, it tends to seek an answer. Reputation does not travel evenly. Some reputations arrive ahead of a person, spoken aloud before they enter a room. Others follow quietly, revealed only when circumstances require them. Backstage, both kinds are recognized, but they are measured differently. The bodyguard's reputation was immediate and physical. It required no explanation. People read it in his shoulders, in the way conversations adjusted around him, in the unspoken agreement that proximity alone was a form of deterrence. His authority was inherited from mass and reinforced by habit. It had worked consistently in countless spaces where size settled questions before they formed. Bruce Lee's reputation, by contrast, was unevenly distributed. To some, he was a marshal, artist known for precision and restraint. To others, particularly those outside training circles, he was simply an actor with an interest in movement. His public image had not yet caught up with the depth of his practice. That gap created ambiguity, and ambiguity in hierarchical environments often invites testing. The two forms of reputation occupied the same space without acknowledging one another. Bruce Lee did not seek alignment or avoidance. He moved as he always did, attentive but unguarded. His posture suggested neither submission nor challenge. It was neutral in a way that made interpretation difficult. Neutrality, in spaces defined by dominance, is rarely understood as intentional. The Bodyguard interpreted it as absence. He had learned over time to trust immediate signals. Hesitation, deference, exaggerated confidence, these were familiar patterns. Bruce Lee offered none of them. Instead, there was a steadiness that did not react to proximity. The Bodyguard stepped closer, not as a threat, but as a confirmation. Bruce. Lee did not adjust. That lack of adjustment registered. In many environments, authority is reinforced through small corrections. Someone steps aside, someone lowers their voice, someone changes direction. When those corrections do not occur, the system notices. The Bodyguard's presence usually prompted these responses without effort. Their absence now created friction, subtle but persistent. Steve McQueen watched without expression. He understood. Reputation is something earned over time, not declared in moments. He had seen posturing fail and quiet competence prevail often enough to recognize when a situation was unresolved. Still, he did not interfere. Whatever was forming had not yet taken shape. The Bodyguard shifted his weight. It was a minor movement, almost instinctive, a way of asserting space without words. Bruce Lee remained where he was, not rigid, not defiant, simply balanced, as though the space already belonged to both of them. To the Bodyguard, this was unfamiliar. Physical authority expects acknowledgement. When it does not receive it, it must decide whether to withdraw or advance. Withdrawal would have contradicted everything his role required. Advancement, even minimal, would clarify the situation. The decision was made quietly. Those nearby sensed it not through action, but through the narrowing of attention. Conversations softened. Movement slowed. The backstage world, usually fluid, became momentarily still. Two reputations had met. Neither had announced itself. Only one would need to explain what followed. The tension did not rise the way people expect tension to rise. There was no argument, no raised voice to signal escalation. Instead, the space around them grew quieter, as if the environment itself had begun to pay attention. Backstage conversations thinned into fragments. People continued moving, but with less purpose. A few stopped entirely, pretending to wait for instructions that had not been given. These pauses were not coordinated, yet they aligned. Something was approaching its conclusion, even if no one could yet name it. The Bodyguard stepped closer. It was not an aggressive movement. It did not need to be. At his size, proximity alone was a statement. He had used it countless times to establish boundaries without incident. The expectation was simple. The other person would adjust. They always did. Bruce Lee did not. He did not brace himself or shift backward. He did not angle his body defensively. His posture remained relaxed, his weight distributed evenly, as if nothing in the environment required correction. To an untrained observer, this might have appeared inattentive. To those who understood physical interaction, It suggested the opposite. The bodyguard noticed the absence of reaction and interpreted it in the only way that made sense to him: uncertainty. In spaces governed by physical authority, stillness is often mistaken for hesitation. The bodyguard's confidence did not come from cruelty or temper. It came from repetition. He had learned what worked, and stillness had never disrupted that pattern before. Steve McQueen remained where he was. He did not signal concern. He did not intervene with humor or command. He simply watched, attentive but detached, the way one observes an outcome that no longer requires guidance. Those closest to him would later say that his expression never changed, not because he anticipated violence, but because he trusted the situation to resolve itself. The bodyguard closed the final distance. The movement was slow enough to appear casual. A hand reached out, not with speed, but with certainty shaped by expectation. This was meant to be the end of the question, a clear boundary drawn through contact rather than words. Bruce Lee allowed the contact. That detail would matter. Later, he did not recoil. He did not resist immediately. He did not acknowledge the gesture outwardly at all. For a brief moment, the scene appeared unresolved. Two bodies connected, neither escalating. What those nearby sensed, without fully understanding, was that the decision had already been made. The challenge had arrived quietly, without witnesses beyond those present. No cameras, no audience, no opportunity to reframe the outcome later. Whatever followed would belong entirely to the memory of those standing there. And memory, unlike spectacle, is difficult to edit. In that stillness, before anything visibly changed, the balance of certainty had already shifted, not because of what was about to happen, but because of what did not need to happen at all. What followed took less time than most people needed to understand that it had begun. There was no visible struggle, no sharp movement to signal resistance. The bodyguard's hand had made contact with Bruce Lee, but it did not complete the action. It was intended to complete. It did not tighten with purpose. It did not redirect Bruce Lee's balance. It simply paused. Those closest noticed a change that was difficult to describe. Bruce Lee did not act against the grip. He did not pull away or push forward. Instead, his body adjusted in a way that did not draw attention to itself. His alignment shifted subtly, as though he were responding to gravity rather than to a person. The change was small enough that someone, watching casually, might have missed it entirely, but the effect was immediate. The bodyguard's posture altered without intention. His shoulders rose slightly, his stance widened, not as a tactic but as a correction. The certainty that had supported his movement moments earlier was no longer present. Whatever leverage he expected to find was absent. Witnesses would later struggle to explain what they saw because there was no single action to point to, no strike, no throw, no clear technique. What they noticed instead was that the connection between the two men no longer favored size. The bodyguard's hand remained on Bruce Lee, yet it no longer served him. It was as though the contact itself had become informational rather than controlling. Bruce Lee's expression did not change. He did not look at the hand. He did not look at the bodyguard's face. His attention seemed inward, precise, and already complete. There was no tension in his shoulders, no strain in his posture. He appeared to be standing exactly as he had been standing moments before. The bodyguard felt it before he understood it. His breathing shifted. His weight redistributed again, this time less effectively. The hand that had initiated the encounter now lacked purpose, suspended between intention and retreat. He had reached the limit of his influence without encountering resistance, and that absence was disorienting. The exchange ended without a signal. Bruce Lee did not remove the hand. The bodyguard removed it himself, not abruptly, not in embarrassment, but with the quiet urgency of someone recognizing that continuation offered no advantage. The space between them reopened. No one spoke. Those present did not react because there was nothing recognizable to react to. There had been no confrontation in the conventional sense. And yet, everyone understood that something decisive had occurred. The demonstration had never been announced. It had never needed to be. It resolved itself the moment force became unnecessary, and in doing so, revealed the difference between power that demands recognition and power that requires none. The change in the room was subtle, but it was complete. Nothing outward had occurred that could be described as defeat. There were no raised voices, no visible injury, no humiliation to mark the end of the exchange, and yet the bodyguard did not return to his previous posture. The way he stood had altered, as though his body had learned something his mind was still processing. Certainty leaves quietly. It does not announce its departure. It shows itself in hesitation that was not there before, in movements that seek confirmation rather than impose direction. The bodyguard's shoulders no longer claimed space automatically. His attention turned inward, recalibrating around a moment he could not easily explain. He avoided Bruce Lee's eyes, not out of fear, but out of recognition. Whatever framework he relied on, size, proximity, confidence built on repetition, had failed without being challenged directly. There was nothing to argue with, nothing to contest. The encounter had ended on its own terms, and those terms did not belong to him. Bruce Lee offered no follow-up. He did not speak. He did not correct. He did not linger to ensure understanding. He simply returned to the rhythm of the space as though nothing unusual had taken place. This absence of emphasis carried its own weight. It suggested that the exchange had not required effort, explanation, or acknowledgement. For those watching, this restraint clarified everything. Authority that seeks validation often lingers after a confrontation. It waits for recognition, for confirmation that it has been seen. Bruce Lee's departure from the moment, quiet, unremarkable, signaled that there was nothing to claim. Steve McQueen noticed the shift immediately. He had spent his life around men who projected toughness, and he understood the difference between confidence that performs and confidence that endures. What he saw was not domination, but displacement. The bodyguard's role had not been taken from him. It had simply lost relevance in that moment. No words were exchanged between them. There was no need. The lesson had already landed, and it did not belong to the kind of language that benefits from repetition. Steve McQueen would later recall that the silence afterward was more instructive than the encounter itself. Backstage slowly resumed its movement. Conversations restarted, though at a lower volume. People returned to their tasks, but with an awareness that something had passed through the space and left a trace behind. These traces do not fade quickly. They settle into memory, resurfacing later when similar questions arise. The bodyguard remained present, but altered. He did his job. He stood where he was meant to stand. But the certainty that had once moved ahead of him now followed behind, cautious and quiet. What he had lost was not status, but assumption. And once assumption breaks, it rarely reforms in the same shape. What remained was not a story of victory or loss, but of recognition. The moment when force encountered something it could not organize around and chose, wisely, to withdraw. Years later, the incident was rarely described directly. It did not lend itself to retelling in a neat sequence of actions. There was no defining move to imitate, no dramatic turning point that could be recreated for effect. Instead, it survived as an impression, something felt more than recalled. Steve McQueen remembered it that way. When he spoke of Bruce Lee, it was never with exaggeration. He did not frame him as invincible or mystifying. He spoke instead about presence, about how some people enter a room and alter its balance without asking permission, about how control, when genuine, does not announce. itself or seek to be understood. The backstage encounter stayed with him precisely because it resisted explanation. McQueen had seen fights. He had seen dominance asserted loudly and publicly. He had also seen fear dressed up as aggression. What he witnessed that day did not resemble any of those things. There was no clash of egos, no visible triumph. Only a brief moment when certainty dissolved and did not return. The bodyguard never spoke of it publicly. In private, according to those close to him, the story changed shape over time. At first, it was dismissed as nothing. Later, it became a moment of confusion. Eventually, it was left untouched. The lesson it carried was not one that benefited from repetition. It worked only once when it was unexpected. Bruce Lee never corrected the story. He did not offer his version, even when others hinted at it. He allowed the silence to remain intact. Those who trained with him later noticed that he taught the same way he moved, without emphasis, without flourish. Efficiency over display. Awareness over assertion. The incident backstage was not an exception to his philosophy. It was an expression of it. As years passed, the story traveled quietly. It moved through actors, martial artists, and crew members who valued competence over performance. It was shared cautiously, often prefaced with doubt, because no one wanted to inflate it into something it was not. That restraint preserved its credibility. The less it was embellished, the more weight it carried. In time, Bruce Lee's public legacy expanded far beyond that moment. Films, interviews, and written ideas shaped how the world came to know him. Yet among those who had witnessed or heard the backstage story firsthand, it held a particular place, not as a tale of defeat, but as a reminder. A reminder that mastery does not need witnesses. That true control leaves no evidence except changed understanding. And that the most enduring lessons are often delivered without words. What Steve McQueen remembered was not what Bruce Lee did. He remembered what no one felt the need to do afterward. No one challenged him again.